My name is Aaron Rester, and I'm the Communications Coordinator at the Center for International Studies here at the University of Chicago. I'd like to thank you all for coming to tonight's World Beyond the Headlines event. The aim of the World Beyond the Headlines series is to bring scholars and journalists together to consider major international issues and how they are covered in the media. It's sponsored by the Center for International Studies, the International House Global Voices Program, the Seminary Co-op Bookstores, and the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. An audio recording will also be available online at WBEZ's Chicago Amplified website, which you can find at wbez.org. If you have any further questions about accessing these events online, please find me after the talk. I'd be happy to answer them. But first, I'll turn it over to the moderator for tonight's event, who is Alison Boden, the Dean of Rockefeller Chapel.
Thank you, Aaron. Our speaker tonight is Ira Chernus. Ira is professor of religious studies at the University of Colorado at Boulder, where he also served as co-director of the Peace and Conflict Studies program. Nationally, he has been co-chair of the American Academy of Religion's Religion, Peace, and War group. His latest book, which is on sale this evening, is Monsters to Destroy: The Neoconservative War on Terror and Sin. He has published extensively on religion, culture, and national security policy during the Cold War era, with special focus on the presidency of Dwight Eisenhower. He is also author of American Nonviolence: The History of an Idea. In addition to his academic writing, Professor Chernus is a frequent commentator on U.S. foreign policy and public affairs. His writings appear often on commondreams.org and tomdispatch.com, and he is a regular commentator on community radio station KGNU in Denver, Boulder, Colorado. Welcome, Professor Chernus.
Well, thank you very much. It's very much my pleasure to be here. I want to thank Alison Boden for the kind introduction. I want to thank my former student, Alex Thompson, who really got this ball rolling, Irving Berkner, who's not here this evening, but I think did a lot of the legwork on setting it up, and all the good folks at International House who have been so helpful. And I must say, this is probably, I'm sure it's the most beautiful room I've ever spoken in. It's quite a pleasure. And it's a special pleasure for me to be here at the University of Chicago, this is actually my first visit ever to this campus, because as a historian of religions, I've always thought of this university as the sacred center of my discipline. I was very much influenced by the work of the historian of religions who taught here for many years, Mircea Eliade, and I've also been much influenced by the work of his student Bruce Lincoln and Professor Jonathan Z. Smith. And Professor Smith once wrote that nothing excites a historian of religions so much as the thrill of coincidence. Well, just by coincidence, when I sat down to write this talk, maybe a couple of weeks ago, I just happened to come across these words from William Arkin, a very insightful analyst of U.S. national security policy. This is what Arkin says, quote, "Terrorists cannot destroy America. Every time we pretend we are fighting for our survival, we not only confer greater power and importance to terrorists than they deserve, but we also at the same time act as their main recruiting agent by suggesting that they have the slightest potential for success." Now, Arkin's surely right about that. No attacks upon American soil can literally destroy America. So why is our public discourse so filled with such apocalyptic talk about the threat to the very existence of our nation? Well, President Bush suggested one good reason when he said, quote, "Today we face an enemy every bit as determined to destroy us as the Axis powers in World War II or the Soviet Union during the Cold War." Indeed, ever since September 2001, Mr. Bush has insisted that the war on terrorism is analogous to, or perhaps even a continuation of, World War II and the Cold War. Those earlier wars taught Americans to view their enemies not merely as opposing nations struggling to change the global balance of power, but as demonic forces who, if allowed, would end the very existence of the United States. In the face of such apocalyptic fears, it seemed only natural that the nation's resources should be mobilized to stave off the threat, that national security should be our highest priority. Those assumptions have become so widespread and so deeply embedded in our national discourse that they generally pass without question. In fact, the whole enterprise of the national security state makes no sense unless you begin with a premise that we are profoundly insecure. So it seems to me more accurate to say that, at least since World War II, we've lived in a national insecurity state. And my current research, actually, I'm looking for the roots of this in the presidency of Franklin Roosevelt. But that's a subject I hope maybe I'll come back and talk about another day. Today, our subject is the current president and his two wars, his war on terrorism and his war on sin, which I see as, in fact, two sides of the same war. As I see it, President Bush and his neoconservative advisors have continued and deepened our state of national insecurity by bringing to the White House a new kind of ideology rooted in a series of narratives that form the basis of their political lives. So let's start with the president himself. Karl Rove claims that when Bush first decided to run for governor of Texas back in 1993, Bush told Rove, quote, "The principal reason I want to seek office is to bring about a cultural change from a culture of the 1960s, which said, if it feels good, do it, to a culture of personal responsibility," end of quote. Now, there's a big story packed into that little sentence. It tells of a battle between two ways of life, one dedicated to instant gratification of every desire, the other devoted to rigid self-control. It tells of a culture gone astray because it chose feeling good over being responsible. And it tells of a hero who appears on the scene to transform the culture by setting it on the path of good behavior. And this is the story that's always been at the center of Bush's political career. He's deftly intertwined it with a story about an evangelical Christian faith. Now, let me say, I don't think we can get into another person's head, certainly not into the president's head. So this question about what he really believes about God or faith or religion, I don't think we can answer, and I don't ask that question. All that we can know for certain is that he's been telling a particular story about his faith, which may be perfectly true, or partially true, or not true at all, we just don't know. But he's been telling a particular story about his faith consistently since about the spring of 1999. And the story should be quite familiar in its basic structure to anyone who knows much about Christian thought. The story says we're all sinners. We're all prone to behave in ways that offend God. Nevertheless, God will accept us if we accept the grace that God gives us through his only begotten Son. But that doesn't make us any less sinful or any more deserving of grace. In fact, in this theology, being convinced that we are sinners, as Bush often says, sinners who don't deserve to be saved, being convinced of that is the prerequisite for and the surest sign of being saved. This is the paradoxical logic underlying Bush's faith story, and it's a story that's shared by millions of Americans. They can feel like winners in a great cosmic contest between God and the devil only because they feel like sinners, and they feel always tempted to take the devil's side. Now, people who live their lives within this story say that it gives them a great sense of certainty, a kind of psychological security that they can't attain in any other way. But to get that security, they have to expect that they themselves will remain a battleground in this great spiritual war between God and the devil for their whole lives. They must believe that at every moment, as the Bible says, sin crouches at the door, ready to spring upon you. And indeed, it's the temptation to sin that gives them a chance to prove how strong their faith is. So in a sense, they need the devil so that they can prove their power to withstand him. So their chosen route to certainty and security requires them to be forever fighting a spiritual enemy. Since they must confess that they are sinners, they must be forever uncertain and insecure about whether they will win the final victory over the devil. And since it's the eternal fate of their soul that's at stake, their insecurity might well rise to the level of terror, which brings us to the war on terror. The crux of my argument is that on September 11th, 2001, George W. Bush took this story about a war of virtue against sin, God against the devil, and he applied it on a global scale to a war against terrorists. Now, there was nothing inevitable about choosing that story to interpret the tragedy of 9/11. There were any number of stories that were available. And when the World Trade Center was first bombed in 1993, the Clinton administration responded with a very different story, a story about crime and criminals who had to be brought to justice, but not a story about war. But on 9/11, Bush and his advisors, most of whom were neoconservatives, immediately began to tell a war story. They had honed these stories very finely before 9/11. So when that tragic day came, the neocons responded with what one famous neocon writer, Robert Kagan, called, quote, their ready-made approach to the world. Now let's talk for a minute about the neoconservative approach to the world. That movement began back in the 1960s in much the same way that Bush says his political career began. It was a domestic crusade by the neocons to undo the evil that they saw in the cultural changes of the 1960s, changes that they still believe threatened to destroy the fabric of American society. In one sense, the neocons' guiding story is the inverse of Bush's Christian story. For the Christians, moral strength is an important sign of and a means to true faith. For the neocons, it's the other way around. Strength is the central value, and religious faith and moral virtue are ways, but not the only ways, to achieve moral strength. But nevertheless, Bush could feel quite at home with the neocons because his faith story agrees in so many ways with the neocon story. They both believe in original sin and the danger that it poses to society. The first great neocon writer, Irving Kristol, once wrote that, quote, the human condition placed inherent limitations on human possibility. Original sin was one way of saying this, and I had no problem with that doctrine. Kristol and so many of the neocons are Jewish, but they adopt a version of the theory of original sin as Bush's own story rests on as well. And Bush and the neocons agree on several other key points. They agree that life is an endless series of contests, that there's a fear of too much freedom, a need for self-scrutiny and self-control, crucial role of traditional moral values in holding society together, and the desire for certainty and the fear of uncertainty. So when 9/11 came, both Bush and the neocons had a fundamental set of premises built into the story that they were ready to apply to that attack. They agreed that the issue was absolute good against absolute evil. They agreed that Americans should not view the attackers as human beings with humanly understandable grievances, but rather the attackers must be portrayed as monsters to be destroyed. The monsters' actions, both past and future, must be presented as a threat to the nation's very existence. If they are agents or embodiments of a demonic force of evil and sin, then they could never be satisfied with anything less than our total destruction. Well, that's the way the president and the neocons have depicted the attackers ever since 9/11. Their stories of the war on terror generate and perpetuate the very insecurity that they claim to stand against. They can never escape the enemy threat because they must always be demonstrating their will and their resolve to confront that threat. If there were no evildoers to fight against, how could they prove their virtue and their strength in the fight against sin? Now, this story had, and still has, a widespread appeal throughout the United States, despite the insecurity that it always engenders. If it didn't have widespread appeal, public support for the war on terrorism would have eroded long ago. As it is, though, although many Americans do criticize the administration's strategy for protecting us from monsters, few seem to doubt the need for a war on terrorism. So the basic apocalyptic structure of the Bush administration's story about a war of absolute goodness, that is, American goodness, against the monstrous evil of the other. That basic structure of the story goes largely unquestioned. And that's not because the public feels more secure. In recent polls, nearly 80% of Americans said they expect another terrorist attack on U.S. soil within the next year, and some 60% said they expect it in the next few weeks. So why then does the Bush administration's story still shape public discourse so powerfully? Well, some Bush critics have a simple answer. They say, oh, the administration and their stenographers in the mainstream media are hiding and tailoring the facts and manipulating us with their propaganda. And no doubt there is some truth in that charge. But I think it's not the whole answer. The government and the media cannot successfully market a story unless their customers, the news-consuming public, are willing to buy it. So what is there in this story of the war on terrorism that makes it such a successful product? Well, I'm going to suggest two different kinds of answers. I'm sure there are many answers, but two in particular I've focused on. First, the story that the Bush administration tells since 9/11 fits perfectly with the apocalyptic worldview that the nation had adopted during the Cold War years and even earlier, back into World War II, even before then. The war on terrorism particularly has revived the Cold War mindset, which made us all citizens of a national insecurity state. After so many decades, it seems natural to most Americans to assume that we face a threat to our nation's very existence from a network of monsters bent on destroying us utterly, even if there's no empirical evidence to support that fear. Every loss of a diplomatic conflict or an economic tussle or a pair of skyscrapers, every loss is once again framed as a portent of looming doom for the nation. We're told that any successful attack upon us could bring down the curtain of Armageddon. And this terror of impending annihilation has again, as in the Cold War, become the vague backdrop of everyday life. Then I see a second reason for the popular appeal of the Bush administration's story of the war on terrorism. And the conservative Christians' war against sin epitomizes this in particularly stark form, but I'm going to suggest it's a more widespread pattern in our culture. So let's go back first to look at conservative Christians, but remember, my point is going to be that what we see particularly clearly in the conservative Christian movement is something that's actually more widespread throughout the culture. Here's Randall Balmer, a leading scholar of evangelical religion, explaining why evangelical Christians have such a strong sense of the battle between good and evil. He says people need boundaries in their lives, a sense of limits, a feeling for what's appropriate and inappropriate, right and wrong, true and heretical. Evangelicalism provides that. For a growing number of Americans, it offers an unambiguous morality in an age of moral and ethical uncertainty, a place of retreat and escape. End of quote. In fact, though, I think evangelicals don't really find a place of escape. Now listen to Richard Land. He's a friend of George W. Bush and a top official in the Southern Baptist Convention. And he recalled the conversation with his wife right after Bill Clinton was elected president in '93. Is a long quote. He says, "My wife and I, we're the same age as the Clintons, same age as the Bushes." She said, "The people that were sitting around in Volkswagen vans, smoking pot with peace symbols on their vans and hanging around their necks, they're running the country now, aren't they?" And I said, "Yes, they are." Basically, this is still Land, it breaks down to this enormous fault line. On one side of this fault line, you have people who have a traditional view of morality. Some things are always right, some things are always wrong. And if you accept a society in which that's not true, then anything becomes possible. On the other side of this fault line, you have what I would call a postmodern worldview. We get to decide for ourselves what's right and what's wrong, what's true and what's not true, to the extent that there is truth. That's the end of the quote from Land. So Land's point is clear enough. If we can decide for ourselves what is true, then he says anything becomes possible. And that's the nub of the problem for conservative Christians. They want to avoid, at all costs, a world where anything is possible. Their personal theology and their rigidly traditional values are ways to convince themselves that it's simply not true that anything is possible. Yet they see themselves surrounded by people who seem to live as if anything is possible. So here again we run into the same paradox. In order to feel more secure, conservative Christians see America plunged into a culture war that makes them terribly insecure. On the one hand, they say, are people who believe that moral values are universal, timeless truths, and once we have those fixed truths, we should stick with them no matter what. On the other hand, these conservatives say, there are the sinners, the secular humanists. They believe that moral values change with the times, that we should each be free to discover or invent values for ourselves based on our individual thoughts and experiences. So in the conservative evangelicals' dualistic view of society, the sinners who reject timeless moral truth are the root of all the world's problems. Now, many sociologists who study this so-called culture war say that this picture is vastly exaggerated. When they go out and do studies, they find most Americans have much more complex, nuanced social views, and they can't be placed neatly either into one box or the other. But conservatives find it comforting to see the world through their simplified, dualistic lens. But in order to get that comfort, they have to believe that they are a beleaguered minority, defending God's virtue against a vast and growing mob of sinners who just want to do their own thing. The conservatives have to see the possibility of sin all around them on the outside, just as they see the possibility of giving in to their own sinful impulses on the inside. Again, in order to feel secure, they must see themselves as highly insecure, beset by enemies all around. It might well add up to a life laced with terror. But it's too easy and misleading to blame conservative Christians for the war on terror. If they were the only ones supporting the war, it would have collapsed long ago, because the story the administration uses to justify it would have lost its legitimacy. And since the story still seems to be so widely accepted, I think it reflects a desire that goes far beyond the conservative Christian community. That is, the conservative Christians epitomize just in particularly clear form a much more widespread longing throughout this country for a clear-cut line dividing good from evil, a line that assures people that there still are indeed absolute moral principles that can never be changed and should never be questioned. The desire to have this foundation of fixed values may be more important on the conservative side than to liberals and centrists, but it cuts across the political spectrum, and it influences the lives of many, perhaps most Americans. So I think the president articulates the deepest appeal of the war on terrorism when he says things like, quote, "We have seen that evil is real. It is enough to know that evil, like goodness, exists." When Rudolph Giuliani addressed the United Nations just a few weeks after 9/11, he demanded that, quote, "The era of moral relativism must end. Moral relativism does not have a place in this discussion and debate." And I think that there were millions of Americans who responded positively to his words, and they weren't all just conservatives. So here's the crux of the problem. Since 9/11, our public discourse has fused together two quite distinct questions. On the one hand, there's the question, how should we seek and find moral truth? Should we look to some external, eternally valid authority, or should we each find our own individual path to the truth? That's a question that has been vexing and will continue to vex American society for a long time. But we cannot deal effectively with that question as long as we fuse and confuse it with another very separate question: how can we keep our nation as safe as possible? As long as the archetypal terrorist serves as our dominant symbol of evil and sin and the devil, we'll not be able to keep those two kinds of questions separate. The war on terrorism locks us more firmly into this basic confusion in our national life. And this confusion has a special impact on political liberals, because with the best of intentions, many liberals support the idea of a war against terrorism abroad as a tragic necessity, while they try to resist the Bush administration's conservative moralism here at home. So they end up unwittingly supporting and legitimating the conservatives' battle against sinners at home as well as abroad. By embracing Bush's story of the war on terrorism, they're drawn into the orbit of his moral quest. The war and the domestic efforts of Bush and the neocons are inseparable parts of the same storyline, a package deal. If you buy one part of the deal, you buy the whole thing. And the whole thing always leads back to the same self-defeating pattern. The national insecurity state undermines the security it claims to provide because it fights against an enemy that it assumes and ensures will always be there. The national insecurity state may speak of its hope for a secure, peaceful future, but there's no way to talk about security without voicing fears of insecurity. There's no way to express optimism without expressing despair. Hope for peace and security, like the whole structure of the national insecurity state, makes sense only if the state sees itself beset on every side by enemies. And the war on terrorism story depends on these premises of the national insecurity state. So it's much harder for the public to grasp a fairly simple point made by historian Walter McDougall. He wrote, "If you go abroad in search of monsters, you will invariably find them, even if you have to create them. You will then fight them whether or not you need to. You will either come home defeated, or else so bloodied that the American people will lose their tolerance for engagement altogether, or else so victorious and full of yourself that the rest of the world will hate you and fear that you'll name them the next monster." And McDougall might have added that some will not fear to be named the next monster. They'll actively seek out the title. They'll be proud of it, and they'll proudly prepare to fight back. Some of them may very well be plotting at this very moment to attack somewhere in the United States. Now, they cannot actually threaten to obliterate our country, but they can kill and harm people in dreadful ways. And here, I think, is the greatest irony. By inducing more people to join the ranks of the would-be attackers, the war on terror, far from making us more secure, is making us less secure and more terrified. And even if we define national security in the Bush administration's own terms, the war on terrorism has undermined our security. You know, the war was supposed to build the new American century, a unipolar world in which the U.S. would be the sole remaining superpower. But every day, it looks more and more like the 21st century will be the multipolar century, with any number of powerful nations and regional groupings successfully challenging U.S. economic, diplomatic, and military preeminence. The administration's unilateralism and militarism has accelerated the decline of U.S. power and influence around the world. Since the war on terror depends on the fears stirred up by the administration's apocalyptic stories, it is those stories themselves that make us less secure, less powerful, less influential, and less able to achieve the administration's goals in foreign affairs. Now, here's the thing that worries me the most about all this. In the years to come, as U.S. power declines, there will be more and more occasions on more and more fronts when the U.S. will meet its match and have to back down. None of these will spell doom for us, but in the national insecurity state, they're likely to be framed as apocalyptic defeats, harbingers of doom, and therefore good reasons to fight back blindly with all our might. I mean, consider as the most recent example, North Korea. Kim Jong-il is taking a lot of risks to develop an atomic bomb. Why does he think it's worth it? A report in the International Herald Tribune quoted a whole bunch of people who really know a lot about North Korea, and they said it's not about attacking or weakening the U.S. It's about North Korea's fears that their conventional military forces are not strong enough to withstand an attack from the outside. So Kim Jong-il concluded, quite logically, that the most cost-effective way to defend his country is to have a nuclear deterrent. the same decision the United States made years ago. But we don't get that story in our mainstream media. Instead, we get America's favorite story, the crazy or foxy dictator who's out to destroy us. The story that once served to legitimate our wars against Germany and the Soviet Union, and are now pressed into service for the Bush administration's war against terrorism, which in turn is supposed to justify the war in Iraq, and perhaps in a war in Iran, and whatever actions are taken against North Korea. And if Venezuela develops a military, the same story will be used against them. It's the same story that is used whenever the United States suffers any kind of diplomatic, economic, or military setback. We are always ready, it seems, to see monsters all around threatening us with extinction. So we're caught in a vicious circle because the administration's aggressive policies weaken U.S. power to control events around the world. And when other nations act independent of U.S. interests, they're depicted as imminent dangers to our national security. And the only response that's allowed in the prevailing story is to ratchet up our strength and fight back. So the story frightens the public into supporting the same aggressive policies that weaken and frighten us even more. We seem to be stuck in this circle. Right now, there's no end in sight. But we don't have to stay stuck. Already, there's growing awareness that the war on terror is doing more harm than good. Even from a few voices in the mainstream media, we hear this. William Arkin, who I quoted early, recently wrote that the war against terrorism is the problem at this point. Well-known writers like James Fallows, who was here just recently, George Soros, David Sanger of the New York Times, all suggesting that it's time to end the war on terrorism. And so perhaps as the losses to American power, American prestige, and American life mount, Americans may eventually see that a simplistic moralism and this pervasive fear of apocalyptic disaster actually weaken our society here at home. And they make every step toward positive change look like a looming danger. And that plays right into the hands of the conservatives who are dedicated to preventing the change that we need so badly. But that still leaves us with a question that nags consciously or unconsciously at huge numbers of Americans. How can we have some kind of shared foundation of absolute moral values undergirding our national life? Is there a new way to think about security that could give us that satisfying sense of moral certainty, yet allow for freedom in choosing our values and make the U.S. more secure, all without any need for finding monsters to destroy? This new approach would have to allow for a commitment to objective, eternal transhuman values, yet offer each individual the freedom to search for their own moral values. It would have to act out a moral drama of good against evil, yet not set America against any enemies. It would have to be based on hope rather than on terror, viewing systemic structural change as progress rather than as threat. And finally, it would have to be rooted in distinctively American traditions to unify the public and satisfy the patriotic urge. Now, to imagine a basis for American policy that would do all that is a very tall order. But it turns out that Americans have been doing that, doing all those things at the same time for a long time. Those of us on the political left don't have to agonize about how to appeal on the basis of moral principle while still promoting a progressive vision and program, because Americans have always managed to combine the two, and usually rather effortlessly, and they still do. We can look back to the abolitionists, the nonviolence movement born in World War I, the civil rights movement, the campaign to end the Vietnam War. All of them had a very strong basis in faith in eternal moral principles. And today, there's a resurgence of progressive faith-based activism and community organizing, not the Bush administration's faith-based initiatives, but truly progressive and socially forward-looking faith-based activism. Many of these people respond to what they hear as a moral call from on high or from some eternal principle deep within, but they don't respond with terror. They don't go searching out monsters to destroy. They open their minds and hearts to all people of goodwill who will work together with them to build a better society. And I think if we want a storyteller who will offer us an alternative, a positive, progressive alternative based on eternal moral principles, an alternative to the story of the Bush administration and the neocons, certainly our greatest storyteller was the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. And whatever he taught was always based on his belief in an eternal, universal moral grounding, which I guess he expressed most famously when he said, "We're caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny." And this was the key to his embrace of nonviolence. He preached that no one can be an enemy to anyone else because no one is ever really separate from anyone else. We're all tied together. All nations are already tied together. The United States is tied to Iran and North Korea and Venezuela, and George W. Bush is tied to Osama bin Laden and Kim Jong-il and Hugo Chavez. In world affairs, as in personal affairs, either everyone wins or everyone loses. There are no monsters, Dr. King taught us. As soon as we start to imagine monsters and set out to destroy them, we destroy the global community, and then we destroy the chance of fulfilling our own nation's highest potentials. Dr. King would have said that we then take a path that leads away from the will of God, who made us all interconnected with and responsible for everyone else. And finally, lest we fear that this vision that Dr. King preached would somehow lead us away from our roots as patriotic Americans, let me close with words that John Winthrop preached as he led the Puritans to the New World way back in 1630. He said, "We must be knit together in this work as one man." Now I think we would say as one person. "We must entertain each other in brotherly and sisterly affection. We must be willing to abridge ourselves of our superfluities for the supply of others' necessities. We must uphold a familiar commerce together in all meekness, gentleness, patience, and liberality. We must delight in each other, make others' conditions our own, rejoice together, mourn together, always having before our eyes our commission and community in the work as members of the same body. So shall we keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace." And I believe that in the 21st century, we really have no choice but to extend that vision beyond our own community, beyond our own nation, to the entire world, and think of all humanity as members of the same body. And so shall we keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Ira. I've been asked to make a few minutes of comment, of response, and I'm glad to do that. I'll do it briefly, and then we shall open things up either to your response to the response or immediately to your good questions. So, moral certainty versus moral freedom is a false dichotomy. Ira states the question this way in his book, Monsters to Destroy, and I quote, "Should we get our moral values from an external and supposedly eternal source rather than from our own changeable minds?" I think we have to take that false dichotomy apart, or it will continue to prop up the binary moral ethical system that Ira describes, one in which the perpetual fight against evil and sin support perpetual conflict with monsters, and in the case of the war on terrorism, as he puts it, the national insecurity state. Moral freedom is sometimes outright denigrated by religious conservatives. I've heard the comment so many times, his or her mind is so open that all their brains fell out. Some people experience the perceived lack of rules or boundaries as perfectly terrifying, a source of terror. I think of a former student of mine in an MBA program Her first career was at Cape Canaveral as a computer engineer, just a highly intelligent woman. And she said to me once of why she was going to the religious community she said, Alison, I want to be told what is right and what is wrong, what is good and what is bad. This world is so complicated. Choices are so hard. I want to be told. I think in the end it's about fearing living with ambiguity. So the two sources for discerning values, external, even divine sources, and inner convictions, are separable and yet need not be separate. I think it's not an either-or. They are also not the only options, and it's important in terms of challenging the false dichotomy to show that we aren't talking at all about a bipolar situation. There are many things apart from the binaries of God and whimsy or licentiousness that create our moral compass. There is experience, empirical knowledge. There is what we learn from families and even degree programs, and exposure to various forms of education and wisdom. It is most possible to adhere to lasting truths, things upon which we refuse to compromise, and simultaneously be open to what our consciences, experiences, and minds tell us is also true. But it doesn't come from a ready-made formula. It's a recipe that every person constructs for themselves, and as I've said, that's downright terrifying to some. Ira made helpful reference to Martin Luther King Jr., and King did this well. He let his eternal religious source of values, his moral formation, open him out into an understanding of moral issues that were broader than the base of his immediate experience. He made connections between moral issues. He drew on many sources for his moral formation. His colleagues begged him not to publicly challenge the Vietnam War. They told him that American society had room, and not much of it at that, for him as a black man to challenge racial discrimination, but not the war, as rooted as it was in money-making for a few and in international politics rather than domestic policy. Arguably, those colleagues were right. 1 year to the day after King came out with his speech on Vietnam, delivered at Riverside Church in New York City, he was shot dead. I was in Vietnam just last year, as it happens, and there was meeting with a group from the university with an economist who told us he had recently been at a conference in Latin America and there met an American who, during the Vietnam War, had been assigned to be in Ho Chi Minh City in Saigon 3 weeks of every month, and the fourth week he would come home to Washington and would meet privately, alone, with Johnson and tell him what he really saw, what he really thought. And this gentleman said that after some time of doing this, what he said to Johnson was, the war is not working, the war is counterproductive, the war is wrong, and we really need to think about how to stop it, how best to stop it right now. And Johnson said to him, we can't stop this war. I got a lot of friends making money on this war. And that, unfortunately, was one driving point for it. Important people weren't making a lot of money off of Jim Crow, but they sure were making it off of the Vietnam War. Which brings us to the great question of power in all of this. The war on terror is about power at home and power abroad. Ira's already outlined the use that Republicans have made of the war on terror and sin in the last national election. In settings like this, I sometimes share the story of a minister who said to me that the reason that conservative Christians are so drastically opposed to civil liberties for and the mainstreaming of gay people is that they, conservative Christians, lost on civil rights, they lost on Vietnam, and they lost on the women's movement. Homosexuality is the only conceivable issue left, and if they lose on that as well, they have totally lost any power to set the terms of the debate, of national discourse, on the question of sexuality, but of so many more things too. They don't want to lose the power to decide for all who will be in and who will be out, what groups or people are acceptable on any issue. They fear losing that total leverage. There's a lot of power in saying that God is on your side, or that at the heart of the issue is a question of sin, other people's sin. This is power-building rhetoric. So yes, it's been employed in spades on the so-called war on terror. There are genuinely violent people around the world and at home, but the demonization of a group of people for the sake of bolstering one group's power has a long and really unflattering history. Think of National Socialism in Germany and who were made to be the enemies of the people there. I'm just back from a trip to Tibet, where the Communist Party demonized religious people and elites generally. The human rights abuse has been massive across the population, but the rhetoric of monster was particularly effective against monks and nuns, to whom unspeakable things were done. The Beijing government has reopened the monasteries and nunneries, but has them under tight control. The dehumanization of any group makes violence against them more possible, and any effort to do that to anyone, even terrorists, simply has to be resisted. Ira says that Bush and the neoconservatives agree on the following. As he put it, life as an endless series of contests, the fear of too much freedom, the need for self-scrutiny and self-control, the crucial role of traditional moral values in holding society together, the desire for certainty and the fear of uncertainty. I would add that this is also true for religious traditionalists from every spiritual community, and perhaps also political traditionists, if there is such a thing. I can't comment on that. I think that the way forward in this is for people from different religious and political positions to affirm these considerations, these points, then change the specific issues at play. Life is an endless series of contests. To forego personal acquisition of wealth or power if it costs others or harms them, to say no to domination in any form, to assert what moral values are most important amongst a panoply of them. The questions posed by neoconservatives are not wrong, they're just incorrectly applied. Freedom, self-control, certainty, these need to be reframed, need to be reworked by others to redirect our national conversation about them. I think we can work with and should work with what the neoconservatives are handing us. I think we are a nation gripped by uncertainty, but our uncertainty is not rooted in being vulnerable to terrorism, to sudden acts of violence from foreigners, or to the difference in lifestyle of our next-door neighbors, but of what we know in our gut. The real value of our wages has gone down. We don't want to retire on dog food. The violence that most threatens us comes from a deranged guy with weapons, a kid with guns in school, a drunk in another car, an intruder into our homes, or a spouse or partner. If we have to have a war on sin, we need to reframe what those sins are. But how much healthier it would be to leave out the rhetoric of sinfulness and of war altogether, all of which demonizes, and focus instead on positively framed projects to eliminate human suffering. What if our new foes, monsters if we must, became poverty, greed, violence, discrimination, lack of education or health care, sexual assault? Well, this would bring us face to face with our own internal questions of social justice. Who makes money from the current way we fund health care? From the insurance industry? Without demonizing, hopefully, we'd have to look at ourselves. Currently, we focus on external villains, and the internal villains that we have are not the people who are doing the talking. The villains are the others, gay people, poor people, immigrant people. The neoconservative style of emphasis on personal morals has been interpreted as meaning that we as a society don't really have to care about such people because their problems are caused solely by the victim's morals, their own bad choices. So there's nothing systemic here. My colleague in the Divinity School, Chris Gamwell, talks about the sufficiency of private virtue. So our own private virtue is what matters, and if I have good virtues and have made good moral choices, I am thriving and I'm doing fine, and the person who is not has simply made bad choices. Again, we don't have to feel any responsibility, only pity, if we wish, for other people's bad circumstances, if only they had better moral fiber. There are real moral challenges in our own society, entrenched poverty within a rich nation, for one. Theologically conservative Christians once championed these causes and could be brought back to them if we could just get their minds out of gay people's bedrooms. But I spoke earlier about how it enhances their own power to keep the focus there. Redress for real moral issues would have to be about justice, not charity, not programs for the poor, for instance, but systemic change so there is no poverty. What we need is a whole new twist on the idea that we are sinful. The moral enemy shouldn't be whether we like alcohol or sex with people of the same sex, but whether we dominate, individually or corporately, whether we are part of social, religious, economic, political, and other structures that empower some at the expense of others on the world scene, on the interreligious scene, on the domestic scene, in our homes, within our religious communities. Christians of any theological stripe can be pointed to the biblical and ethical imperatives for this. I'm sure there are similar resources in other traditions. And to stretch across religions and involve the non-religious, I don't know, we may really need to find generally American values and ways of getting at it. As Ira has said, equality is a deeply American value. What if we expanded and improved our political equality into material, economic, religious, and social equality? In the face of all these questions, Muslim extremists are a really soft target, an easy one, a convenient other, and for many people probably a preferable target than the systemic change we'd be looking at if we identified monsters in our own midst, who are not individuals, but entrenched inequities. Ira has reminded me of the potential for 9/11 to be a turning point. Once forced to our knees, we might there have looked around and noticed a world on its knees. But we didn't. If a biblical prophet were around today, he or she would say, they're rending their garments, but not their hearts. Grieving people sometimes change. Scared people, to say nothing of terrified people, people pumped up on terror, rarely do. They circle wagons and become very defensive. Rudy Giuliani's response to 9/11 was far from perfect, but at least in the beginning, he did speak to the grief and not yet the fear. But then again, speaking of power, perhaps by then he had decided to parlay his actions into another term as mayor. I'll leave it at that. Okay, we've got a microphone right there for your questions and comments.
Hello, how are you doing? My question has to do with sort of the overall theme of your talk, Ira. And it seemed to me that one of the, especially with the end of your presentation, has to do with language and how we use language to talk about American response or reaction to national crises or events. And you mentioned talking about, this idea of creating, good versus evil is not necessarily the way to respond to crisis. But I think we would say that it is part of American history to be one of the ways that this happens. And consistently throughout history, you mentioned John Winthrop. And even, in this early colonial period, eventually with the Native Americans, they resort to language of good and evil. So my question is, given that there are these multiple ways throughout American history to respond to crisis, how do you choose one? Or how do you market to the public one over another? So it would be probably insufficient to say Martin Luther King represents the American way of dealing with crisis, but that he represents one of a number of ways of dealing with crisis.
Sure, I think that's true. And I don't think we get much of a choice, really, quite honestly. No one of us, or even all of us together, could control the way Americans talk. It's way too complicated. And I think perhaps the best thing to say is that we can encourage, whenever we can, a kind of language that goes beyond the simplistic good against evil. And, I think Dean Boden's remarks give us lots of examples of how that can be done. But that we're going to have a lot of this good against evil talk, whether we like it or not. Okay? And that we can make strategic choices as to which groups to ally with and which groups to support as they use that language. Because even in Dr. King's language, even though in theory he should never have talked about anybody as an enemy, in fact, there was a significant amount of we know what good is, and there are people out there who are doing ungood. And so I think you can't get away from that kind of language. So it's more a question of being willing to work different communities that have different modes of language that feel right and best to them, being willing to work together I'm not sure that's really answering your question, but it's what's on my mind now, so maybe we'll get back to it later.
Hi, thank you for coming, Professor. Correct me if I'm wrong, but earlier in your talk, you said that Bush and many of his advisors have accepted the notion of original sin. But you also said that they view the world as being this kind of dichotomy, with America being an absolute good and an absolute evil. So how do you reconcile those two notions?
Right. That's the question that Reinhold Niebuhr put to American leaders so forcefully for several decades. And the fact is they don't reconcile them. And I first recognized this pattern in a big research project that I think hopefully finally finishing on Dwight Eisenhower. And in Eisenhower's language, you find both of those patterns. And it sounds like maybe you studied a little bit of theology, and you know that in theory, those are two quite different patterns, and they're really incompatible. But the reality is that we have political leaders, and I think we can trace this way back into colonial times in the United States. Americans have been fairly comfortable using both of those traditions on a kind of a mix and match basis. And it's one of the things I hope my work might be useful in bringing out, that there is a theoretical contradiction, and you really have two different historicals. You've got an apocalyptic tradition and an Augustinian tradition, to put it somewhat simplistically, and that they don't belong together theologically. But in the reality of the culture, it works that way. And the reason that it's so dangerous is because when you take from the apocalyptic tradition this dualistic notion that we're absolute good, they're absolute evil, and then you take from the original sin notion the notion that their evil will never disappear, that there's nothing we can do. As I often say, we define the problem in apocalyptic terms, but we don't believe in an apocalyptic solution. The apocalyptic solution would be get rid of the evil, right? But that's, at least during the Cold War years, that's barred. And I think, despite all the things that Bush says, if you actually look at the policies of the Bush administration, they don't plan to ever eliminate terrorism either. Bush himself has slipped a few times and said we're always going to have terrorists. So you have that notion that the sin, the evil, the monster will always be there, but that we must fight it as if we were always fighting the last apocalyptic battle. That's pretty much the way the two get put together. Sharp question. I heard students here were pretty smart. I appreciate that.
I would like for you to address the historical context of the response to the attack on the World Trade Center versus the war in Iraq. And the reason is the attacks on the World Trade Center represented one of the most humiliating experiences in this country's history. It's very comparable to what happened in 1941 with the attack on Pearl Harbor. And another similarity is that the kamikaze model of using airplanes in suicidal missions was raised to enormous levels by the jumbo airliners full of jet fuel that were used as kamikaze aircraft, killing thousands of people. This, it seems to me, was an act of evil genius. What was pulled off on September 11th, 2001, I don't think anyone can argue with the proposition that it was evil. And I don't think
well, some people could argue with it, but I won't. Go ahead.
Well, I wouldn't either.
Okay.
And I don't think anyone can argue with the proposition that it was an act of genius. This country was caught asleep, as we were in 41, and we suffered enormous humiliation. Now, the response to the attack on the World Trade Center was directed at an identifiable group, Al-Qaeda, Taliban government in Afghanistan. Where you get to a real moral dividing line is when the neocons promoted the war in Iraq. And I wish you would address the historical context of the immediate response to the World Trade Center attacks and the war in Iraq, and the absolute fraud that was perpetrated in order to justify that war.
Well, it's true, within the neocon movement, but first I wanted to say, Alex, you see, this gentleman might be the kind of person who feels quite comfortable using the language of evil that we would want to be able to work together with on that sort of thing. There's a clear historical record that the neocons certainly were talking about Iraq as a potential target. Paul Wolfowitz wrote his doctoral dissertation right here at this institution in the mid or late 70s, warning about the military threat that Iraq might pose. He was one of the first people to say that. That was a long time ago. When Charles Krauthammer developed the notion in his newspaper columns of America as the unipolar sole remaining superpower after the end of the Cold War, he started focusing on the twin dangers of Iraq and weapons of mass destruction. In other words, the script that Bush used in 2002 to ramp up for the war in Iraq was already being written by Krauthammer and other neocons in the early 1990s. In the late 90s, the PNAC, the Project for a New American Century, wrote a formal letter to President Clinton urging him to essentially get rid of Saddam Hussein or regime change in Iraq. So yes, so there's a clear paper trail among the neoconservatives that shows that they were focusing on Iraq long before 9/11. And apparently the anecdotal evidence that's come out in a few of the books is that immediately after 9/11, they were talking about, people like Cheney and Rumsfeld and Wolfowitz were talking about going after Iraq immediately. So yeah, there's no doubt that that's true, and that now the Bush administration is staking its whole war effort in terms of keeping any degree of public support. As the public support erodes, the only strategy that the Bush administration has for keeping public support of the war in Iraq is to use the same rhetoric that they've been using since 9/11, to say, okay, we have to show how strong we are. We can't cut and run. We have to have will and resolve. Again, casting the whole thing in these moral categories, because they can't really make an effective argument in practical terms. And I'm not sure the neoconservatives ever did either. So much of it, again, to come back to my basic approach, so much of it is a kind of an acting out of a symbolic moral drama in these different arenas, and Iraq was chosen, for now at least, to be the central one. We are moving into a phase where Iran may become, and who knows what's going to happen with North Korea. So that's about the best I can say. Please.
There's a lot of things I'd love to ask you, but I have a feeling other people will too. So I'm going to stick with the question that I had when I actually stood up to come up here, which is that to step over on the other side, so to speak. It would seem that in a lot of the, the sort of pseudo-fatwas issued by Osama bin Laden and, say, the Ayatollah Khomeini's characterization of America as the great Satan, that the other side in our battle, to so to speak, I'm using their terminology again, is using the same sort of apocalyptic, dualistic language and ideology. First of all, do you think that's true? And second of all, has the irony of this ever dawned on people in the United States?
Oh, well, I think there's a lot of truth in it, although when you look at two sets of discourses that appear to be mirror images, I'm sure if you look carefully you can always find differences. But the best thing that's been written on it, as far as I know, is by your very eminent historian of religions here, Bruce Lincoln, in his book Holy Terrors. And Bruce was the first person, I think, out of the box to show in detail how much parallel there is between the language of the Bush administration and the language of Osama bin Laden and others associated with Al-Qaeda. And I just was having some supper earlier with Bruce and said, well, I said, Bruce, beyond your book, Holy Terrors, who else is studying this stuff? And we both drew a blank. So it appears that, although as a kind of a generalization, the idea that there's this kind of mirror image between the fundamentalisms is quite often spoken about. Apart from Bruce's book, I don't know of anybody who's really gone into any depth and nuance and tried to tease it out. But I think by and large, it's one of those generalizations that becomes sort of a cliche because it's really true, more true than not. Thanks.
Hi, I want to thank you for bringing us some new insights and ways of looking at the world to us. And I was wondering how you handle the concept of preemptive war versus just war within the schema that you've kind of outlined for us.
It seems to me, and I may defer to you on this, I suspect you may know more about this than I do. You know, I've never been really that interested in just war theory, because I got interested in all this stuff when I got active in the anti-nuclear movement in the early 80s. And I know that there was a big, rich discourse, part of it carried on here at this university, about how just war theory applies to nuclear weapons. And to my mind, that was a bunch of very smart people sitting around trying to figure out under what conditions should we annihilate another country with nuclear weapons. Well, I'm being a little facetious, because to my mind it was pointless. I mean, I don't know enough about just war theory to know. I do know that there are experts who go into all the nuances of it. I believe it's fair to say that if you're applying just war theory in a kind of a technical sense, with all the particular criteria that have to be met, there probably are cases where a preemptive war is permissible under just war theory. Do you know?
Oh, there certainly are, and which have been called into question by many people who supported the war in Iraq. Now that we know more, the question of there being weapons of mass destruction that could harm us, that could harm our allies, that needed to be taken out immediately, was the major criterion for the war, but also for it being a just war. And that did fall into the great majority of people's rubrics of what does make a just war, preventing greater suffering or suffering for yourself by striking first.
Thank you. I appreciate you coming today, and I don't really know where to start. I got tons of pages of things here. I guess the biggest question that keeps coming back to me is this one that asks, what... You don't seem to be mad at the people who blew us up. You don't seem to have anything to say against them or in defense of our positive action toward cutting off their ability to continue such action that they started. I mean, it seems to me that you don't believe that this concept of radical Islam exists, and there's no real reason for us to consider physically doing something about it. It seems to me that you believe that we can defeat this idea of radical Islam through talking with people. And it seems to me that the things that those people who are most powerful and most violent and most dynamic against us in radical Islam are telling us that all they want to do is blow us to smithereens. I don't have much personal doubt that if there were 15 to 25 nuclear weapons in the hands of someone like either Osama bin Laden or here, I'm sorry, my mind is not going so well, that they would hesitate to use them if they had a chance to get those suitcase nuclear bombs in around Washington, D.C., around New York City, around Los Angeles, around us. You do that around the top 15 to 20 cities of the United States, and pretty much we are gone. I don't see how the quote, the phantom of a paradigm you draw, which is in the mind of President Bush and us neocons, is something that is more dangerous than the thing that seems to be pointed at us.
Well, I appreciate a good confrontive question like that. I really do. And maybe this gives me a chance to plug my book, which my publisher would have wanted me to do earlier. No, but in the book, I start with the assumption, the premise, that from a purely practical point of view, in absolutely pragmatic terms, the policies of the Bush administration since 9/11 have not made us more secure, right? And the primary evidence of that is that they seem to generate more and more enemies, that is, more and more people enlist in the anti-American cause. And so if, in fact, their goal were to make us more physically secure, then they're just going about it in a clumsy way. They're just doing it wrong. And so that was my starting point, and perhaps I should have made more clear in my talk that that's my starting point. So then you think, well, why would they do that? Maybe they're just inept. Maybe they just don't know how to make us more secure. No, I don't think that's the case. I think that even if, and I did say there probably are people right now who are sitting around trying to figure out how to launch some sort of attack on the United States, the question is, how can we most effectively maximize our chances of averting that, heading that off? And again, I guess maybe this is a good way to conclude, to summarize my main point, that in any case where someone wants to do you harm, if your primary goal is to prevent harm to yourself, right, then the first thing you got to do is treat that other person as a human being, not as a monster, not as a demon, right? Because whatever it is that is motivating that person to want to do you harm, it's in your interest to figure out what it is. And like I use this analogy, it's a little bit simplistic, but I think it's kind of true. Let's think of 9/11 as kind of like you're walking down a street and out of the blue, for no apparent reason, somebody just comes out and smacks you on the head, right? And there are basically two different kinds of responses. One is you can kind of clear your head, jump up, and smack him back. Or you can say, why did you do that? And I'm of the second group. Who knows? Maybe it's a genetic thing. I don't know why. So let me just make one more point, and then sure, I'll get to hear what you want to say. On the night of September 11th, 2001, when I was told by the media over and over again that Osama bin Laden was behind this, I thought to myself, who is this guy Osama bin Laden? Why would he want to do that? And fortunately, Google was already available to me, and it took about 4 minutes for me to find an almost endless stream of interviews with Osama bin Laden, statements by Osama bin Laden, where he said the same thing over and over and over again. And what he said made sense. It wasn't irrational. It wasn't crazy. It wasn't monstrous, right? He said he had 3 particular grievances against the United States. Now, that doesn't in any way justify the way that he chose to respond, assuming that he was responsible for this attack. It doesn't in any way justify the attack on the World Trade Center or the Pentagon. But it does say that if from a purely practical point of view we want to keep ourselves as safe as possible, the first sensible thing to do is to go figure out why do these people say they did it. And since they tell you very clearly why they did it, you can then say, well, it was about getting American troops out of Saudi Arabia, ending the sanctions against Iraq, and ending U.S. support for the Israeli occupation of Palestine. Right, 3 issues. Then you could say, would it be worth changing American policy on those 3 issues in order to defuse the kind of fury that we saw on September 11th? There's no guarantee that it would defuse it, but would it be worth at least taking that chance? But of course, the Bush administration wanted to make sure we never had that debate. And so the fact that there were these 3 very specific reasons that were given by al-Qaeda for the attack was simply kind of erased from the historical record. Now, I want to invite you back to the microphone if you want.
I'm sorry. I just feel like the slap we got in the head was maybe in 1979 with the hostages who were kept in Iran. I think the slap in the head might have been the bombing in 1993 of the World Trade Center at that time. And at that time, we could have said, hey, look, what is going on? And I just am not convinced that those reasons that were given by bin Laden are actual reasons that they're going to go with. The reason I say this is because there is, again, it's bigger than just bin Laden. It's more the Islamofascist idea that they want to reestablish the caliphate and establish Sharia law, which obviously, you know, I've been smoking this stuff, okay? I've been really reading a lot of the stuff into what they're talking about. So I feel like if that's their real establishment, not just get out of Palestine or give Palestine some land and get out of Saudi Arabia, I don't think that addresses or them changing our policy addresses what they really want. Is that,
Oh boy, yeah, there's a lot there. First off, the little bit that I know, and my friend Alex knows more about this than I do, Islam and fascism are incompatible terms. I don't think, in fact, you can be an Islamic fascist. So that's a kind of a buzzword that's being created that I think from the beginning sort of steers us on the wrong track. But if indeed there are people who are dreaming of establishing a caliphate that would stretch, from Morocco to the Philippines, in the first place, it's so unrealistic. I'm not sure. I mean, you can worry about anything. I could worry about walking outside and getting hit by lightning, too. But in the second place, I suppose, even if that were the case, if it's something that you think is inimical to your interests, remember, they've never said anything about establishing political rule in North America. Okay, did you agree with me about that? They have said that. Okay. And then I've missed that. You have a text, a document you can point to? Okay, I haven't seen it. But if they have it, it's a pretty marginal part of their discourse. So let's assume, though, that you think, for whatever reason, that if Muslims want to establish a single unified political entity stretching from Morocco to the Philippines, that's bad for you. I don't know why, but maybe you assume that. Okay. I suppose if I lived in Morocco or the Philippines or any place in between, I might say, what business is it of yours how we conduct our political structure? That's kind of like the British saying to the 13 colonies, we don't want you guys to unite. We want to keep you 13 separate colonies. And our founding father said, what business is it of yours? But even if you had a legitimate grievance about the political structure of Islam, I still want to come back to this point that if your practical goal is to have more leverage in preventing certain political formations that worry you, right, you're still better off treating those people as human beings just like you and me who have needs and aspirations and families that we worry about and values that we cherish and fears that, and seeing those people as full three-dimensional real people rather than as sort of the two-dimensional kind of cardboard monster Islamo-fascists that the Bush administration presents to us. I guess that's probably the best I would say. I don't know. Any experts on the politics of Islam here who might want to chime in?
Can I say also, I don't mean to say that these people are practicing Islam. They're using Islam as a tool to do something wrong, what they want to do. I mean, the Nazis claim to be Christian, but they're not. And these people, the Klan claim to be Christian, but they're not. And these people claim to be Islamic. They're not. They spread it pretty well.
No. Are you a Muslim?
No, I'm not.
See, then I don't think that you have the right to say who's a Muslim and who's not. And even, like, if you're a Christian, I don't think you have the right to tell a Ku Klux Klan member that they're not Christian. They may not be Christian the way you would like them to be Christian, but I've sat in classrooms for the last 30 years hearing some Christian students tell other Christian students that they're not real Christians, right? But as a historian of religions, my view is anybody who comes out of a Muslim community and proudly wears the label Muslim is a Muslim. And they kind of, as in any other religious community, they sort of tussle it out among themselves to see which way, what shape their religion's going to take in the future. But I don't think it's our place to tell them that they're not Muslims. And I say this partly because the president, of course, has been doing this since September 2001. He's arrogated to himself the right to decide who gets to count as a real Muslim and who doesn't. And if I was a Muslim, I'd be pretty insulted to have this evangelical Christian telling me whether I'm a real Muslim or not. Even if he likes my kind of Islam, I still would feel resentful. Thank you very much.